Hello everyone and welcome to Art Smart. Today I'm just using this lovely day outside to make this video. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of the watercolor today. Now, the watercolor is a painting, obviously, and it's become quite popular for people to buy a relatively inexpensive work of art. In most cases, sometimes it can get pretty expensive. Now, why is watercolor such an interesting subject? Well, it is one of the few things that has been around since the dawn of art. The earliest cave paintings that you find are technically going to be watercolors because it was basically very simple substances from the earth that was mixed with water and then put onto the walls, and so that's where early cave paintings come from. Now, watercolor has had a long history, but it has been kind of forgotten for a large portion of its lifespan. Why? Well, the main reason is people have found other materials that have been a little bit more realistic in what they can do. Sculptors obviously can use things like marble or stone to carve, and people that do painting have found over time that oils are far better when it comes to making very, very realistic tones and creating that illusion of reality. Now, watercolor has continuously been used in Eastern cultures over history, and it has been very, very popular when it comes to like Chinese painting and Japanese painting, and that is mainly because they haven't been as concerned in Eastern art in whether or not the art that they are creating is realistic. In that culture, they have a little bit more leniency, or at least over time they have had, in looking at things other than just realism in art. But in Western culture, people didn't utilize watercolor in art for quite a long time. When you are looking at Western culture, you have the Egyptians that used quite a bit of this style of art, and then it pretty much stopped until you get to the Renaissance. Albrecht Dürer decided to utilize watercolor in his paintings because he was a very experimental guy. He actually is really important when it comes to other forms such as art prints. He was very experimental in the things that he did, but watercolor, and especially his watercolors of animals, have been really celebrated over time, and it got artists interested, at least for a period of time again, in watercolors. After a kind of resurgence of watercolors after Dürer's work, again, watercolors kind of fell away again, and it was mostly utilized for preparatory works, where artists that were going to use oil paints would start using watercolor. When time moves along, though, you get to the 18th century, and William Gilpin was somebody that was a traveler, and he used watercolors to help demonstrate all of the wonderful things that he saw as he traveled around the world. And reprints helped to make watercolors popular again. As you get into the latter part of the 1800s, you start seeing some of the Impressionist artists start practicing using watercolor before they use oil, and then sometimes they would just say, you know what, I kind of like the watercolor, and they kept it. And post-impressionists kept utilizing watercolor after that. Once you get past the 1800s, you get into the early part of the 1900s, where art just exploded and people were okay with using pretty much anything as art, including non-traditional objects. Really, when you get to the 20th century, a lot of the conventions that were utilized over art history were just thrown out the window, which is good and bad depending on how you look at it. But for watercolor, it was definitely a good thing, as people started taking it seriously as its own independent work of art, and you start seeing much more in the way of watercolor being utilized. Another way that watercolor really exploded in the early part of the 1900s, well, I don't know, 1930s, 40s, Disney started to utilize watercolors as backgrounds, especially in Dumbo, their feature film. It's a cost-effective way of painting backgrounds and works of art without necessarily sacrificing fully on quality. Disney found that you could make some lovely watercolor backgrounds, and the movie Dumbo really, really celebrated how watercolor can be utilized in the background of a film. So watercolor today is seen as its own legitimate art form, and you can buy it at pretty much any kind of art store, and it's not necessarily looked down upon, and it shouldn't be. But over the course of history, watercolor has not been so celebrated, and so I thought it was interesting to bring that up today. Please leave your comments, please ask questions, and please make sure that you continue to art smart. Bye-bye, everybody.